the firstborn Ishmael. Ishmael was originally the firstborn of Abraham. However, Ishmael was not the son born according to God's promise, but was instead naturally born through human methods. Ishmael was born into Abraham's household before Isaac, but he neither continued the lineage of Abraham's faith, nor gained the honor of becoming an ancestor of Christ. God had already declared that his life would be like that of a wild donkey. A wild donkey refers to an untamed donkey, known for its rough and stubborn nature. This signifies that Ishmael would lead a life devoid of faith. Even though he was born in the household of Abraham, who is called the father of faith, Ishmael would live a faithless life, and his life would be rough and difficult. We too, who live without faith, are destined to lead lives like wild donkeys. Nevertheless, God, in his grace, has given those of us who live like wild donkeys, like Ishmael, the blessing of being tamed through his word and under his providence. While there are those who are tamed by his word and grace to live lives of faith, there are still many in the world who live like wild donkeys. The two sons in Abraham's household represent the typical characteristics of believers and non-believers today. In truth, all humanity was created by God's grace, and it is by that grace we breathe, receive our daily sustenance, and gain strength to move. In the world, there are those who recognize this grace and live within faith, and there are also those who, despite this grace, fail to recognize it and live faithless lives like wild donkeys. So why does God allow some to live lives like wild donkeys, rather than ensuring everyone lives a life of faith? Is it because God does not desire that everyone knows his grace, receives salvation, and obtains eternal life? Many people have such doubts and, at times, may pour out complaints and grievances against God because of them. What I want to emphasize now is that even lives like ours, which are like those of wild donkeys, can still become children of faith. In the time of Moses, a descendant of Abraham, God commanded Moses that all firstborn animals be offered to him. However, for the firstborn of a donkey, God said that it must be redeemed with a lamb, or its neck must be broken. This instruction was not because God had enmity toward donkeys, but because in the Bible donkeys often symbolize humans. In other words, God would not accept the donkey as it was. He required it to be exchanged for a lamb, which symbolizes Christ. This was to signify that God would accept Christ in place of humans. The command to break the donkey's neck, if it was to be offered directly, symbolizes the stiff-necked and stubborn nature of humans, indicating that God cannot accept humans in their natural state. This means that humans, with their wild donkey-like nature and temperament, cannot be accepted by God as they are. It is only through Christ that we can be accepted. In other words, God shows us that even lives like ours, which resemble those of wild donkeys, can still approach him through Christ. Ishmael, who began in a household of faith but lived a faithless life in a world devoid of faith, seemed to be outside God's grace. Yet, even for them, God opened a path to faith. Although Abraham, Isaac, and Ishmael are no longer alive in our time, there are still lives lived under grace, and lives lived like those of wild donkeys in the world today. However, even those of us who are like wild donkeys, if we wish to live under God's grace, Christ is always willing to be our sacrificial offering and our ransom. Therefore, do not abandon those who live like wild donkeys by succumbing to the unbelief of non-believers. Instead, believe that anyone can be tamed and redeemed under the grace of Christ, and be God's faithful people who share and spread that grace to others.
구독, 좋아요, 알림 설정 해주세요. Subscribe, like, set notifications.